The morning Lucy Wainwright knelt in the red Arizona dirt and opened a primer to a group of children who had never seen the inside of a schoolhouse. She had no idea that the most powerful man in Cactus Bend was watching her from the ridge above. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Cactus Bend sat at the edge of the Sonoran Desert like a wound that refused to heal cleanly. The railroad had not come through yet, though men in expensive suits from back east kept promising it would. The main street was a single line of sun-bleached timber buildings. A saloon, a general store, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, and a jail that saw more business than any of the others combined. The surrounding land was divided mostly between the desert itself and the vast cattle empire of Hayes Ranch, which stretched some 40,000 acres from the southern bluffs all the way up to the Papago foothills. Lewis Hayes owned every one of those acres, and the people of Cactus Bend knew his name the way they knew the name of the sun, unavoidable, powerful, and largely indifferent to the smaller lives moving in its shadow. Or so they believed. Lucy Wainwright had arrived in Cactus Bend 6 weeks before the morning in question, riding in on the mail stage from Tucson with a leather trunk, a wooden crate full of books, and a letter of employment from the Territorial Board of Education that was worth approximately as much as the paper it was printed on in a town that had never once funded a schoolhouse. She was 26 years old, brown-haired, with sharp green eyes that took in a room the way a hawk takes in a field, quietly, completely, missing nothing. She was not delicate. 3 years of teaching in a mining camp outside of Silver City, New Mexico had stripped any delicacy she might have started with and replaced it with something tougher and more honest. What Cactus Bend had not told her in its letter of invitation was that there was no schoolhouse. There was a half-finished foundation at the edge of town where a schoolhouse had been planned, then argued over, then abandoned when 2 of the town's leading men decided they disagreed about the placement of the front door. The children of Cactus Bend learned what they learned from their parents, which in many cases was very little, or they learned nothing at all. Lucy had stood in front of that empty foundation on her first morning in town and pressed her lips together in a thin, determined line. Then she had gone to the general store, purchased a length of muslin fabric and 4 wooden stakes, fashioned herself a shade canopy, and started teaching on the spot. That was 6 weeks ago. By now, the classes had grown into something recognizable. Every morning at 8 o'clock, between 12 and 17 children ranging from 5 to 14 years old would appear at the edge of town near the abandoned foundation, sit cross-legged in the dirt beneath the muslin canopy, and listen to Lucy Wainwright teach. She taught reading from the primers she had brought. She taught arithmetic using pebbles and sticks. She taught history and geography from memory when the books ran short. She brought a globe she had packed carefully in her trunk, and the children would pass it from hand to hand with the kind of reverence usually reserved for church objects. The children were a mixed group, which was one of the things that the more conservative members of Cactus Bend found troubling. There were the children of Anglo settlers, and there were the children of Mexican families who had been in the territory for 2 and 3 generations, and there were 2 children, a boy named Tomás and his younger sister Paloma, whose mother was from the Tohono O'odham people and whose father had died in a cattle accident 2 seasons prior. Lucy taught all of them the same things at the same time in the same dirt, and she did not see why this should be remarkable, though several townspeople made a point of telling her it was inappropriate. She ignored them with a cheerfulness that they found more maddening than argument would have been. It was on a Tuesday in late April that Lewis Hayes rode down from the ridge. Lucy was in the middle of explaining long division using a diagram she had scratched into the dirt with a pointed stick when she heard the sound of hooves. She did not look up immediately, because horses passed through all the time, and she had learned not to break concentration over every disturbance. But this sound was different. It was measured, unhurried. the sound of a horse being ridden by someone who was in no particular hurry because the world generally waited for him. She looked up. Louis Hayes was 32 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who spend most of their lives outdoors do, weathered and solid and comfortable with himself. He was broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly under the brim of a well-made hat that was not flashy, but was clearly expensive in the way that things are expensive when quality is the only consideration. He rode a bay quarter horse with the easy confidence of a man who had grown up on horseback, and he was dressed in working clothes, not his Sunday best, which somehow made him look more formidable rather than less. He pulled the horse to a stop at the edge of the makeshift classroom and looked at the scene before him with an expression that Lucy could not immediately read. It was not contempt. It was not amusement. It was something quieter and more complicated than either. The children had gone silent. Even little Rosie Caldwell, who was 5 and had approximately no capacity for silence under any other circumstances, was staring at the man on the horse with her thumb planted in her mouth. "Mr. Hayes," Lucy said, because she knew who he was. Everyone in Cactus Bend knew who he was, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "Good morning. We are in the middle of arithmetic. If you have business in town, the general store is about a quarter-mile further on." "I know where the general store is," Louis Hayes said. His voice was low, with the slight rasp of someone who spent more time outdoors than in rooms with soft furnishings. "I've been watching from the ridge." "Have you?" Lucy said. She kept her tone even, but her grip on the pointed stick tightened slightly. "For about 3 weeks," he said. "I ride that ridge most mornings." Lucy tilted her head slightly. "And what conclusion have you drawn from 3 weeks of observation?" Something moved in his expression. "That you're more stubborn than anyone I've met in this territory," he said. "And I've met a fair number of stubborn people." One of the older boys, Miguel, who was 11 and had a quick, watchful intelligence that Lucy thought about a great deal, let out a small, involuntary sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. "Thank you," Lucy said, because it was not a compliment she had any intention of disputing. "Will you be moving along, then?" Louis Hayes dismounted. It was a fluid, easy movement, and he tied the bay to one of the stakes, holding up the shade canopy with the casual confidence of a man who intended to be there a while. Then he walked around the edge of the sitting children, found a clear space in the dirt, and sat down. Just like that. Louis Hayes, the wealthiest man in 3 counties, owner of Hayes Ranch and everything the eye could see in most directions, sat down in the dirt among a group of children ranging from 5 to 14, crossed his long legs in front of him, and looked at Lucy Wainwright with an expression of patient attention. The silence that followed was so complete that Lucy could hear a mockingbird calling from a mesquite tree 30 yards away. "What are we learning?" Louis Hayes asked. His voice was perfectly calm. Lucy stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then she looked down at the division diagram she had scratched in the dirt, looked back at him, and made a decision. "Long division," she said. "Do you know it?" "I know enough to get by," he said, "but I suspect your method is better than what I was taught." That was not what she had expected him to say. She had expected arrogance or condescension, or possibly an announcement about the land this classroom occupied and who owned it. She had not expected humility, quiet and apparently genuine, from Louis Hayes. She turned back to the dirt diagram and continued teaching. The children, after a moment of collective stunned disorientation, followed her lead. Because children are fundamentally practical creatures, and Lucy's calm gave them permission to be calm. Louis Hayes sat quietly in the dirt and listened, and when Lucy asked a question, he waited to see if the children would answer before he offered anything. And when he did speak, he spoke to the children directly, not over them. He stayed for the full 2 hours of the morning session. When the children dispersed for the midday break, scattering like sparrows toward their various homes for noon meals, Louis Hayes stood and brushed the red dirt from his trousers with the same unhurried calm with which he had sat down. Lucy was stacking her primers in a careful pile when he walked over to her. "You're teaching the Wadem children," he said, Not a question exactly. More like an observation he was testing. I am teaching the children, Lucy said, without looking up from her stacking. That includes Tomás and Paloma, yes. Some people in town won't like that. Some people in town do not like anything that requires them to extend common decency beyond the borders of their own yard, Lucy said. I find that's generally not a problem I'm able to solve to their satisfaction, so I've stopped trying. There was a pause. That's a fairly direct way to talk about your neighbors, Lewis Hayes said, and there was something in his voice now that she thought might be appreciation, though she was cautious about being certain. I spent 3 years in a mining camp in New Mexico territory, Lucy said, finally looking up. I have a limited supply of patience for evasion. She met his eyes directly. They were dark brown, she noted, and they held their ground in a way that suggested he was accustomed to people looking away first. She did not look away. Why did you sit down, Mr. Hayes? He seemed to consider this seriously, which she appreciated. I'm not entirely sure, he said after a moment. I've been watching from that ridge for 3 weeks and I couldn't figure you out. I thought sitting down might help. And did it? Not entirely, he said, but it was a better use of 2 hours than what I'd planned. Despite herself and against her better judgment, Lucy Wainwright felt the beginning of a smile. She compressed it into something more neutral. What had you planned? Arguing with my foreman about the eastern fence line, Lewis Hayes said, which I can tell you from experience never ends satisfactorily. She did laugh then, a short, genuine sound. He looked at her when she laughed with the slightly startled expression of a man who had not quite expected it to happen and was not sure what to do with how much he liked it. The fence line will keep until tomorrow, she said, turning back to her books. Most things do, he agreed. He retrieved his hat from where it had somehow ended up on the ground, settled it on his head, and went to untie his horse. At the edge of the clearing he paused. Miss Wainwright, Mr. Hayes. The school board argument, he said. The 2 men who can't agree on where to put the front door. I've heard about it, she said carefully. It's my land, he said. The foundation. I donated it for the school. He paused. I can resolve the argument about the front door if you want the building. Lucy went very still. She had not known the land was his. She had assumed it belonged to the town. She set down the primer she was holding and turned to face him fully. Why would you do that? She asked. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face that was not quite readable, not secretive, more like a man who was accustomed to keeping his deeper considerations to himself and was slightly surprised to find himself considering speaking them aloud. Because you're teaching in the dirt, he said, and you're doing it better than most people teach in buildings. He settled his hat more firmly. Think about it. Then he rode away up the ridge road, his back straight, the bay horse moving easily beneath him, and Lucy stood in her patch of Sonoran desert dirt and watched him go with an expression that she would have been hard-pressed to describe to anyone who had asked. She thought about it. She thought about it through that afternoon, when she went to the church for the reading group she ran 3 times a week for the adults in town who had missed out on schooling as children. She thought about it while she was making her supper on the small wood stove in the single room she rented above the general store from a woman named Mrs. Pepper, who had the great virtue of minding her own business. She thought about it lying in the dark that night, listening to the desert sounds, the distant coyotes, the wind through the mesquite, the occasional muffled argument from the saloon 2 blocks over. She was not thinking about the building particularly. She was thinking about the man who had sat down in the dirt. She had known wealthy men before. Her father had been a man of some consequence in Ohio before the war had undone most of the family's fortunes, and she had grown up around men who understood their own importance the way the air understands gravity. Those men did not sit in the dirt. They did not listen. They did not say, "I'm not entirely sure" about anything, because uncertainty was a weakness and wealthy men did not traffic in weakness. Lewis Hayes had sat in the dirt and been uncertain and meant it. That was the thing that kept turning itself over in her mind. The following morning he was back. He rode down from the ridge at 5 minutes past 8, tied his horse to the same stake, and sat in the same spot in the dirt. He brought a blanket this time, which he laid on the ground with a matter-of-factness that suggested he had given the comfort question its proper amount of consideration and resolved it practically. He did not mention the offer about the building. He simply settled in, and when Lucy began the morning's lesson American history, the founding documents, a subject she loved with a fierce and particular passion, he listened with the same quiet attention he had brought the day before. The children had adjusted. Children are remarkable in their capacity to normalize the unusual, and within 20 minutes of his arrival, they had stopped watching Louis Hayes with wide eyes and simply accepted him as part of the classroom, the way they had accepted the globe and the shade canopy. Only Miguel watched him from the corners of his eyes with that careful measuring intelligence, the way young people sometimes watch powerful adults to understand what they are really like beneath the surface. Near the end of the session, Lucy was reading aloud from the Declaration of Independence. She had a copy in one of her primers, when she looked up and found Louis Hayes looking not at her, but at Tomás, who was 11 years old and whose mother worked at the laundry down the street, and whose future in Cactus Bend was a thing that Lucy worried about considerably. Louis Hayes was looking at Tomás with an expression that was entirely unguarded, which surprised her more than anything yet. He was watching the boy listen to the words, "All men are created equal," with something that looked very much like pain. When the session ended and the children scattered, Lucy found herself standing beside Louis Hayes without entirely having decided to walk toward him. "His mother," she said quietly. "She's struggling since his father died." Louis Hayes looked at her. "I know," he said. "Ernesto Ruiz worked my herd for 6 years. Good man." He paused. "The accident wasn't on my land, but it was my cattle." Lucy understood then something about why this man had been watching from the ridge for 3 weeks. "What did you do?" she asked. "What I could," he said, in a way that suggested what he could do was considerably more than most men could. "But it's never enough." He was looking out at the horizon, and Lucy had the sense that he was a man who carried a considerable weight of such calculations. The things he had done, the things he had not been able to do, the mathematics of power and its inevitable insufficiencies. "It isn't," she agreed. "But you do it anyway." He looked at her then, and the look was of someone who did not quite expect agreement and found it disorienting in a not entirely unpleasant way. "The building," Lucy said, because she had made up her mind in the night and she was not someone who delayed once a decision was reached. "Yes, if you mean it, yes." "I mean it," he said. "I want to be involved in the plans," she said. "Not just handed the finished product." "That seems reasonable." "I want the entrance facing east so the morning light comes in," she said. "I want 2 windows on each side wall. I want a floor, not a dirt floor, because I am done with dirt floors in classrooms. And I want a place to store the books so they don't suffer from the heat." Louis Hayes reached into his coat pocket and produced a small leather-bound notebook and a pencil stub, and he wrote all of this down. When he looked up, he caught her expression's slight surprise, and something shifted in his face that was warm and brief. "I'm a practical man, Miss Wainwright," he said. "If you know what you want, it's easier to give it to you." She was aware, in the way one becomes aware of certain things too late to be comfortable, that the sentence had a quality to it that extended beyond schoolhouse construction. She chose not to address this. "Good," she said. "Shall we say you'll speak to the school board this week?" "I'll speak to them today," he said. He was as good as his word. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the school board, such as it was, being largely 2 stubborn men named Alderman Pierce and Frank Grudy, who had been in a standoff about the front door for 4 months, had been informed by Louis Hayes that construction would resume on Monday, that the entrance would face east because the schoolteacher had specified it, and that anyone who wished to continue arguing about it was welcome to do so elsewhere. Alderman Pierce had tried to object, had looked at Louis Hayes's expression, and had decided that a door facing east was perfectly acceptable. Lucy heard about this from Mrs. Pepper, who heard it from the general store's other regular customer, a cheerful and well-informed woman named Delilah Torres, who heard it from her husband, who had been in the saloon at the time and had witnessed Alderman Pierce's rapid retreat with evident satisfaction. Lucy stood in the middle of her small rented room and felt something that was dangerously close to being moved. She reminded herself firmly, a schoolteacher. She was here to teach. She was not here to be moved by wealthy ranchers with dark eyes and leather notebooks and the capacity to sit in the dirt without making it into a performance of virtue. This reminder was only partially effective. Construction on the schoolhouse began that Monday, as promised. Lewis Hayes sent 6 men from his ranch, which was more than was technically necessary and was clearly a statement of commitment. The townspeople who had been sitting on the fence about the whole project now discovered that they had been enthusiastic about it all along, and several of them contributed lumber and labor as the week progressed. Lucy continued teaching in the dirt while the building went up around the corner. She found this symbolic, though she was careful not to be too self-satisfied about it. There was something right about not interrupting the work of the present in anticipation of the future. Lewis Hayes came every morning. That was the thing that people in Cactus Bend began to notice, and once noticed began to discuss, in the particular concentrated way that small frontier towns discuss anything that departs from the expected pattern. The wealthiest man in the territory, sitting in the dirt every morning with a group of children, learning things he had probably already known, listening to a schoolteacher from Ohio with a leather trunk and an opinion about window placement. It was unusual. It was remarkable. It was, according to Delilah Torres, who had an eye for these things, absolutely adorable. Lewis Hayes, for his part, appeared to be completely indifferent to the discussion. He came every morning because he wanted to, and in Lucy Wainwright's classroom dirt floor, makeshift canopy, mockingbird in the mesquite, nobody told Lewis Hayes what he could or could not want. On the 4th morning, she asked him about himself. It was not a calculated decision. They had been sitting side by side while the children worked on a writing exercise. She had found a quantity of cheap paper in the general store and given each child a pencil stub, and in the easy quiet of people working together, she had simply asked, "What was your schooling like?" she said. He looked up from the primer he had been examining with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "Patchy," he said. "My father believed in working knowledge. He could calculate anything in his head related to cattle and land, and he considered that sufficient education." "And was it?" "For running a ranch, mostly," Lewis Hayes said. "For everything else, not particularly." He turned a page of the primer. "My mother was different. She read everything she could get her hands on. We were in Texas before Arizona. She used to send away for books and they'd arrive 6 weeks later all the way from St. Louis, sometimes with the spines cracked from the journey." A pause. "She died when I was 17. "Fever?" "I'm sorry," Lucy said. "She meant it completely." "She would have liked this," he said, with a gesture that took in the classroom, the children, the makeshift canopy. "She would have liked you." Lucy looked at him. In the clear morning light, she could see things she had not noticed at the beginning, a small scar above his left eyebrow. The way his hands were large and scarred in the way that hands are when they have done real work for a long time. The fact that when he was not performing the role of Lewis Hayes of Hayes Ranch, his face was something different. Quieter, more uncertain, more interesting. "My mother died when I was 12, she said, and was slightly surprised to find herself saying it. She was not in the habit of offering her history. Childbirth, the baby too. "I'm sorry," he said, echoing her own words back to her with the same plainness, and she found that she liked that he did not elaborate or expand on the condolence. "My father was kind," she said, "and then the war took most of what we had. And then I found that teaching was the thing I could do that felt like it mattered, and I've been going to wherever they need teachers ever since." She straightened a stack of papers. "Mining camps, river settlements, now a frontier town with a dirt classroom." "Do you ever want to stop?" he asked. "Settle somewhere?" She considered the question honestly. "I've wanted to feel like I could," she said. "There's a difference." Something in his face shifted very slightly. "Yes," he said, "there is." The schoolhouse was finished in 3 weeks, which was remarkably fast and was a direct result of Lewis Hayes throwing substantial resources at the problem without making a great show of it. Lucy walked through it on the morning it was completed, running her hand along the fresh-cut timber of the walls, checking the east-facing entrance and the windows and the wooden floor that was nothing elegant but was solid and real. There was a bookcase along the back wall that no one had told her about, built by one of the Hayes Ranch carpenters, with a note nailed to the front shelf in handwriting she did not recognize but suspected had been written by Lewis Hayes himself. The note said, "For the books, so they don't suffer in the heat." Lucy stood alone in the empty schoolroom and felt the thing she had been telling herself not to feel with a completeness that suggested the telling had not been particularly effective. She was falling in love with Lewis Hayes. She stood very still with this information for a long moment, the way one stands with something fragile, and then she did what she had always done when confronted with a large and potentially overwhelming reality. She organized it into manageable pieces and approached it practically. The facts were these: he was a good man, which was rarer than it should have been and more important than almost anything else. He was kind without making a performance of it. He was curious in the genuine sense, interested in learning things he did not already know. He had sat down in the dirt, which was the kind of act that reveals character in a way that no amount of Sunday suit and careful speech can manufacture. The complications were also these: he was the wealthiest man in 3 counties, which meant that his life and hers were structured so differently that the gap might as well have been a canyon. She was a woman who had built her independence carefully over years, and she was wary of anything that might unmake it. And she had been in Cactus Bend for 7 weeks, which was hardly long enough to be confident about anything, let alone this. She filed all of this carefully and went to get the children. The first day in the new schoolhouse was one of the best of her life, and she had had some good days. The children came in and took their places on the benches, real benches, sanded smooth, and looked around at walls and windows and a real floor with expressions that made Lucy's chest ache. Little Rosie Caldwell sat on her bench and ran both palms along the wood and made a small sound of pure satisfaction that required no interpretation. Lewis Hayes was at the door at 8 o'clock. He looked at the full classroom, at the light coming in through the east windows, at the globe sitting on the teacher's table, and then he looked at Lucy and did not say anything. And the thing he did not say filled the room quite adequately without words. He sat in the back of the room on the bench nearest the wall, because there was not quite room at the children's level for a man of his size without displacing someone, and he was careful about that. He brought his own pencil and a proper notebook this time, and he wrote things down, and when the children asked him questions during the discussion sections, which they had begun to do with increasing confidence, he answered them with honesty and without condescension. Miguel, the watchful 11-year-old, asked him during a geography lesson how big Hayes Ranch actually was. Lewis Hayes said 40,000 acres. Miguel considered this. "If you stood on one edge and walked to the other edge," he said, "how long would it take?" Lewis Hayes thought about it. "Depending on which direction and how the land lay," he said, "probably 2 days on foot, maybe a day and a half on a good horse." Miguel's eyes went wide. "Have you ever done it?" "Not all the way through on foot," Lewis Hayes said, "though I've ridden most of it." "Why?" Miguel asked. Lewis Hayes paused, and Lucy watched his face, and what she saw there was something she recognized, the particular expression of someone trying to articulate something they have never quite put into words. "Because it helps me understand it," he said finally. "Things are different when you're in them than when you're looking at them from the outside." Miguel nodded slowly, as though this was a piece of wisdom he intended to keep. Lucy wrote the same words in the margin of her lesson notes and told herself she was doing it for pedagogical reasons. She was not entirely convincing herself. The trouble, when it came, arrived in the form of a man named Chester Holt, which was somehow the most fitting name trouble could have arrived under. Chester Holt was a cattle buyer from Tucson who passed through Cactus Bend twice a year on his way to various ranches, and who had very strong opinions about the proper order of things, and who had heard from sources he considered reliable that the Hayes Ranch schoolteacher was running some kind of mixed-race classroom that was upsetting the proper social arrangements of the territory. He arrived on a Wednesday. Lucy was in the middle of a reading lesson, the older children reading aloud from a shared text, while the younger ones practiced their letters on small slates she had managed to obtain from a supply catalog, when Chester Holt appeared in the doorway of the new schoolhouse and announced himself by clearing his throat with the aggressive confidence of a man who expects the room to stop and attend to him. Lucy did not stop. She continued listening to young Amelia Grudy read aloud, making a small, encouraging motion with her hand when Amelia hesitated over a difficult word. Chester Holt cleared his throat again, louder. "If you need a glass of water," Lucy said without looking up, "the pump is around the corner. Miss Wainwright." His voice was flat and had the particular texture of authority that comes from a lifetime of having subordinates. "I'd like a word." "I'm teaching," Lucy said. "If you'd like to take a seat, you're welcome to wait. Otherwise, I'll be available at noon." Chester Holt was not accustomed to being told to sit down and wait by a schoolteacher, but there were children staring at him, and the room had a quality of organized purpose that made disrupting it feel more socially costly than he had anticipated. He sat. He waited. His expression indicated he was not enjoying the process. At noon, Lewis Hayes arrived. This was not, strictly speaking, his usual time. He came in the mornings, but he appeared at the schoolhouse door at noon that Wednesday with a paper-wrapped parcel that turned out, when Lucy unwrapped it with the bewildered expression of someone who does not receive parcel deliveries mid-school day, to contain a proper midday meal from the hotel kitchen, 2 servings, carefully packed. He had brought lunch. Lucy stood holding roasted chicken and cornbread and looked at Lewis Hayes, who looked back at her with the same expression of calm intention he brought to everything, and she decided that whatever he was doing, she was going to deal with it after Chester Holt. Chester Holt was, unfortunately, still present when Lewis Hayes arrived, and the two men knew each other in the way that men who move in the same commercial territory know each other, not warmly, but transactionally. "Lewis," Chester Holt said, standing. "Chester," Lewis Hayes said with minimal inflection, "I was just having a word with your schoolteacher." "She's not my schoolteacher," Lewis Hayes said. "She's the town's schoolteacher." "What's the word?" Chester Holt explained. He did it in the careful language of a man who knows he is on thin social ice, but is committed to crossing it anyway. Phrases like "concerned community members" and "proper arrangements," and "the way things work in this territory." What he meant was clear. He did not approve of a classroom that included Mexican and indigenous children alongside Anglo children, and he was proposing strongly that arrangements be made to separate them. Lucy, who had been listening with absolute stillness and absolute control, said, "No," Chester Holt blinked. "I beg your pardon." "I said no," Lucy said. Her voice was perfectly even and completely final. "These children learn together because learning is not something that benefits from being rationed according to parentage. My classroom is open to every child in Cactus Bend, and it will remain so." "Now, Miss Wainwright," she said. "No," Lewis Hayes said. He had not raised his voice. He had not shifted his posture or made any gesture of threat. He had simply placed himself beside Lucy's position, not in front of it, and stated it as fact. Chester Holt looked between them. He was not a man who folded easily, but he was also a man who understood arithmetic, and the arithmetic here was that Lewis Hayes was more important to his business interests than whatever principle he had arrived to defend. "This conversation is not over," Chester Holt said. "It is for today," Lewis Hayes said pleasantly. "Have a safe ride back to Tucson." Chester Holt left with the pointed dignity of a man making a retreat he intends to call something else. When the door closed behind him, the afternoon air in the schoolhouse was very quiet. Lucy became aware that she was holding a paper parcel of chicken and cornbread and that Louis Hayes was standing approximately 3 feet from her and that the distance felt significant. "Thank you," she said, because it was the right thing to say and because she meant it. "You didn't need me," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it was good to have you there." There was a pause of the kind that has a great deal of content. Louis Hayes looked at the parcel in her hands. "Sit with me," he said. They sat on the schoolhouse steps in the noon sun and ate roasted chicken and cornbread from the paper wrapping, and the mockingbird from the mesquite tree had apparently followed them from the old classroom site and was performing in the mesquite 20 yards to the north, and the afternoon light was the particular amber gold of the Arizona desert at midday. "Chester Holt won't leave it there," Lucy said. "No," Louis Hayes agreed. "He'll write to the Territorial Board of Education. Probably. And they may listen to him, because he has money and influence, and I am one schoolteacher with a principal and a primer." Louis Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Not just one schoolteacher," he looked at her. "I have some influence with the board. I've never bothered to use it because it never mattered to me before. It matters now." Lucy looked at him carefully. "Why does it matter now?" she said. The question hung in the air between them, and she watched him consider it and watched him decide, and the decision when it came was quiet and certain. "Because you matter," he said, "and the children matter. And what you're building here is something real, and I'm not going to let a cattle buyer from Tucson with an opinion dismantle it." He said it plainly, the way he said most true things, and Lucy understood that the first part, "because you matter," was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and that he had intended it to. She looked out at the desert. "Louis," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the fact of it landing differently than any of the dozens of times she had said Mr. Hayes was not lost on either of them. "I need to say something directly." "All right," he said. "I am not interested in being a project," she said, "or an acquisition. I have built my own life carefully and I intend to keep it. I am not looking to be rescued." "I know," he said. "Good," she said. "Then I am also going to say that I think about you with a frequency that has become difficult to attribute to professional gratitude." Something moved in his face, surprise, and then something warmer than surprise, and then the particular expression of a man who has been holding something in reserve and now no longer needs to. "I think about you constantly," he said. "Since the first morning I watched from the ridge. I watched you teach in the dirt for 3 weeks and I thought about you every day on the ride home." "That's considerably longer than I've been thinking about you," Lucy said, with a trace of her usual wryness, "which seems unfair." "I had a head start," he said with the ghost of a smile. "I saw you first." "You saw me from a ridge on a horse," she said. "I didn't know you existed. That was my disadvantage, yes." Lucy looked at him for a long moment. In the amber light, with the mockingbird performing its complicated aria in the mesquite, and the red dust of the Arizona afternoon settling in the windless air, Louis Hayes of Hayes Ranch looked like exactly what he was, a man who had spent a long time being certain about everything except the things that mattered most, and who had sat down in the dirt one morning to learn something he did not yet know the name of. "I would like to start over," she said. "Not from the beginning. I like the beginning. I just mean, I would like to begin whatever this actually is." "So would I," he said. "Very much." They finished the cornbread in a comfortable silence that had a different quality than the comfortable silences before, and then Louis Hayes walked her back to the schoolhouse door, and when he left, he touched the brim of his hat, and Lucy stood in the doorway watching him go with an expression she did not attempt to compose. In the weeks that followed, the pattern of their days shifted in ways that were visible to everyone in Cactus Bend, and commented upon with enthusiasm. Louis Hayes continued to come to the morning sessions, though now the presence was openly acknowledged between them as being for more reasons than one. He began joining Lucy on her midday walks. She had a habit of walking the perimeter of the town each noon for the air and the thinking space. And in the evenings, when the general store where she rented her room was closed, he would sometimes arrive at the side door with a book or a newspaper from Tucson, and they would sit on the small porch that faced the desert and read and talk. He was a surprising conversationalist. She had half expected, from the evidence of his position and his reserve, that he would be limited to cattle and land and territorial politics. He was not. He had read widely, in the erratic self-taught way of people who did not have the benefit of formal education, and who therefore approached books with a passionate independence rather than the slightly jaded familiarity of the schooled. He had opinions about things. Strong ones which he expressed without embarrassment and revised when she gave him reason to. He revised things. That was the part she found most remarkable. She had known any number of men who accumulated opinions the way other men accumulated debts, defensively, and with no intention of paying them. Louis Hayes would say something, she would push back, and he would actually consider it and occasionally change his position, and this was, in her experience, essentially miraculous. She told him about Silver City and the mining camp, the children who came to school in shifts because half of them had work obligations, the fathers who resented the time their sons spent with books, the mother who had once brought her a cake made from something so basic it was practically just flour and water, and said it was the best thing she had to give in exchange for what Lucy was giving. He listened the way he listened to everything completely, and with the part of him that was genuinely present, not the part that was composing the response. One evening in early June, she told him about the reason she had left Silver City. There had been a man there, not a romance, nothing of that kind, a mine superintendent who had objected to her insistence on teaching the children of Mexican workers alongside everyone else, and who had made the situation untenable in ways that were not technically illegal, but were comprehensive and exhausting. She had left because staying would have destroyed something in her that she valued more than the victory, and she had not entirely forgiven herself for it. "You left because you understood the cost-benefit," Louis Hayes said. "You preserved yourself so you could go somewhere else and keep teaching." "That's a generous interpretation," she said. "It's an accurate one," he said. "There's no value in martyrdom if the result is you're too broken to teach anybody." She looked at him. "Your mother taught you that," she said. It wasn't a question. He was quiet for a moment. "Not in those exact words," he said. "But yes." She told him then about her father, who had been a good man but an overwhelmed one, who had managed the aftermath of the war and her mother's death and the loss of their property with a kind of grieving steadiness that she had loved him for even as a child. He had died 4 years ago, quietly in the house of her older brother in Columbus, and she had not been there because she had been in Silver City, and this was another thing she had not fully forgiven herself for. Louis Hayes put his hand over hers, on the porch railing in the dark, without saying anything. He left his hand there for a long time, and she turned her hand over under his, and that was all that happened, and it was more than enough. Chester Holt did indeed write to the Territorial Board of Education, as he had promised. The letter arrived in mid-June, and with it came a response from the board requiring Lucy to submit a formal accounting of her classroom composition and teaching methods. This was the kind of bureaucratic pressure that had broken less determined people, and Lucy wrote the response at her small table by lamplight over the course of 2 evenings, and it was a document of such thorough, detailed, and calmly devastating clarity that Louis Hayes, who read it when she showed it to him, said nothing for a full minute, and then said he thought it was the finest piece of writing he had encountered in the territory. Louis Hayes also wrote to the board, separately. She found this out from Delilah Torres, who found out from her husband, who found out from the mail carrier, who mentioned it with the air of someone sharing intelligence of military significance. She asked Louis about it directly, and he told her what he had written, which was essentially that Lucy Wainwright was the most qualified and effective educator in the territory, and that any interference with her methodology would be a loss that Cactus Bend and the territory could not afford, and that he expected the board to act accordingly. The board acted accordingly. Chester Holt received a politely worded response that was, in all the ways that mattered, a dismissal of his complaint. Lucy received a letter of continued support. She read it standing in the schoolhouse before the children arrived and then sat down on her teacher's chair and pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. When she opened them, Lewis Hayes was in the doorway. "How did you know to come now?" she said. "I ride the ridge most mornings," he said. "I saw you sit down. You don't usually sit before the children arrive." She looked at him. He was backlit by the morning sun, which was excessive and theatrical, and she chose not to hold it against the sun. "Come here," she said. He came. He sat on the edge of her teacher's table, which accommodated his weight with a slight creak of protest, and she told him about the letter, and his face did the thing she had come to love, that brief, unguarded warmth before the composure settled back. "Good," he said, then. "You did that, not me. My letter helped, but yours was what decided it." "We did it," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "We did." The summer deepened. The Arizona heat became something that had to be navigated rather than merely endured, and Lucy moved the afternoon sessions earlier to avoid the worst of it, and added a water break that involved the children bringing clay cups from home, which she filled from the schoolhouse water barrel with an efficiency she secretly found satisfying. Lewis Hayes had given up the pretense of being merely an interested educational observer. He was at the school in the mornings. He walked with Lucy at noon. He brought books and newspapers, and once, in an act of perfectly calibrated understanding, a small wooden box of chalk in 3 colors, which he presented to her with the casualness of someone who had thought of a useful thing and acted on it rather than making the gift into an occasion. She had looked at the chalk and then at him and said, "How did you know I needed chalk?" "You mentioned it," he said. "3 weeks ago. You said the blackboard would be more useful if you could color-code the mathematics." She had mentioned it in passing, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, and he had held on to it for 3 weeks and acted on it when he could. She made him supper that evening, on the small wood stove in her rented room, which required negotiating the stove's particular character flaws with a skill she had developed over months. She made beef stew from a recipe her father's housekeeper had written in the flyleaf of a cookbook she had carried from Ohio, and Lewis Hayes sat at her small table in her small room and ate it, and said it was the best meal he had eaten in years. "Better than what you get at the ranch house," she said. "I have a cook at the ranch," he said. "Good one, but this is different." "How?" He looked at her from across the small table. "Because you made it," he said. "Here." She held this for a moment. "That is dangerously close to being romantic," she said. "I'm finding romance more manageable than I expected," he said, with the ghost of the smile she had come to watch for. "You've been practicing," she said. "Every morning," he said. "For months." After supper, they walked to the edge of town in the cooling evening air and stood at the place where the desert began, where the last of the town's lights gave way to the enormous dark of the open land, and the stars were the particular brilliance of a desert sky, which is like no other sky in its completeness and abundance. Lucy was aware, standing there, that something was happening between them that was both obvious and unuttered, and that the unuttered quality was becoming a presence of its own, and that this was probably the correct moment to do something about it. She turned to face him. He was already looking at her. "Lewis," she said. "Lucy," he said. She had been preparing a sentence. She abandoned it. "I love you," she said. "That's all. I just love you, and I thought you should know, because I'm not built for keeping things unsaid indefinitely." The expression that crossed his face in the starlight was something she had no adequate word for: a man arriving, after a long journey, at a place he had not been entirely certain existed. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since the 3rd morning I sat in the dirt, and you corrected my understanding of the Missouri Compromise with a patience that was so clearly costing you something. And I thought, that is a remarkable woman." "The Missouri Compromise correction was necessary," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "It was entirely necessary," he agreed. He reached up and touched her face just briefly with the back of his hand, and she turned her face slightly into it the way one turns toward warmth, and then he kissed her, which was quiet and certain and entirely without theater, the way the best things are. They stood in the desert dark for a long time after, not talking much, because the talking had been building toward this and now the quiet was the right register. "What happens next?" Lucy said eventually. "I'd like to court you properly," Lewis Hayes said. "Which in this case means everyone already knows what's happening, but I'd like to do it with some formality regardless." "I appreciate the formality," she said. "Within reason." "I'm a reasonable man," he said. "You sat in the dirt voluntarily," she said. "You are a reasonable man." He laughed, a real laugh, full and surprised, and she stored the sound of it carefully. The courtship proceeded with formality and without, over the remainder of the summer and into the fall. There were Sunday dinners at the hotel, which were the Cactus Bend equivalent of formal public declaration, and there were evenings on her porch, and mornings at the school, and midday walks, and the countless small domestic details of two people learning to be in the same space. How he took his coffee black, no argument, how she managed her terrible memory for where she had set things. She always put her spectacles on the third primer from the left in the bookcase, which he discovered when she spent 15 minutes searching for them one morning, and from which point he always checked the bookcase first. He took her to see Hayes Ranch in September. She had requested this, wanting to understand what his life was when he was not in the schoolroom, and he rode out with her on a gentle mare from the ranch stable. The ranch was extraordinary not in the way of wealthy excess, but in the way of something that had been built carefully over years and maintained with genuine care. The land was working land, which meant it had the particular dignity of things that are used with respect. The hands who worked it touched their hats when Lewis passed, not with the stiffness of performance, but with the ease of men who respected their employer and were respected in return. He showed her the cattle operation, the horse breeding, the equipment stores, the bunkhouse where the hands lived, and finally the house itself, a rambling adobe and timber building that was larger than she had expected and considerably less formal. His mother's books were still in the sitting room, in a case along the south wall, and when she saw that, Lucy ran a hand along the spines and did not say anything because there was nothing quite adequate to say. "You kept them," she said finally. "Of course," he said, as though the idea of not keeping them had never been a real possibility. She pulled one out at random. It was a copy of Jane Eyre, worn soft with reading. She opened the cover, and there was a name written in careful script, Eleanor Hayes. She put the book back very gently and turned around, and Lewis Hayes was watching her with the expression she had come to associate with the things that most deeply moved him. "She would have liked you," he said again. The same thing he had said that first noon on the schoolhouse steps, and this time it landed differently because now she had touched something of Eleanor Hayes's and felt the dimensions of the woman who had shaped her son. "I think I would have liked her," Lucy said. They ate supper in the ranch house kitchen that evening, made by the cook, a capable, quiet man named Ramon, and afterward sat in the sitting room among Eleanor Hayes's books, and Lewis read to her from Dickens, which he did well, with a natural ear for the voices, and she fell asleep in the armchair listening, which was both undignified and so profoundly comfortable that she had no regrets whatsoever when she woke to find Lewis Hayes reading quietly and the house dark except for the lamp. "I should get back to town," she said, sitting up. "It's late," he said. "I've already sent word to Mrs. Pepper that you'd return in the morning." She raised an eyebrow. "You can have my mother's room," he said. "I'll take the bunk room." "That is extremely proper of you," she said. "I told you I was a reasonable man," he said. "I didn't say I was unreasonable about all of it." She slept in Eleanor Hayes's room, in the bed that still had Eleanor's quilt on it, and it was the finest bed she had slept in years, and she lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, the cattle and the horses and the distant sound of someone's harmonica from the bunkhouse, and thought about what it would mean to say yes to this life, and found that the prospect of it felt like coming home to a place she had not known she was traveling toward. In October, Lewis Hayes asked Lucy Wainwright to marry him. He did not do it in the schoolroom, though there was a part of her that would have found that appropriate. He did it on the Ridge Road, the same ridge from which he had watched her for 3 weeks, on a clear October morning when the desert below was lit in the particular golden quality of the fall, and the schoolhouse roof was visible in the distance, and the mockingbird's mesquite tree was a spot of green against the ochre earth. He said, "I want to build something with you, not for you with you. I want to sit in dirt classrooms and ranch kitchens and on porches in the dark for the rest of my life, and I want you to correct my understanding of the Missouri Compromise whenever it requires correcting, and I want to love you openly for however many years I have." He paused. "I have a ring that was my mother's. I hope that's all right." "It's more than all right," Lucy said. "Is that a yes?" "Louis," she said, with the patience she reserved for people she loved very much who had just said something that required gentle clarification. "Yes, that is absolutely a yes." The ring was an oval garnet set in gold, which was exactly right, not a diamond, which would have been showy and wrong, but something rich and dark and particular, the way Alina Hayes's books had been particular. They married in November, in the church that doubled as a meeting hall, which was full beyond its comfortable capacity, because most of Cactus Bend wanted to see it. The children from the school sat in the front pews, which Louis had arranged, and Rosie Caldwell wore her best dress and sat very straight and looked as though she considered this event to have been organized primarily for her benefit, which nobody disputed. Miguel sat beside Tomás and Paloma and their mother, who had come in a good dress, and when Lucy walked down the aisle with her hand in Louis's arm, Miguel caught her eye and gave her a nod of solemn approval that was so adult and deliberate that she nearly laughed out loud. The Reverend officiated with genuine warmth. Louis said his vows in a steady voice, looking at Lucy the entire time, and she said hers looking straight back at him, and the ring went on her hand, and there was the kind of quiet in the room that only happens when everyone present understands they are watching something real. Delilah Torres cried. She was unembarrassed about this and cried productively into a good handkerchief. The wedding supper was held in the hotel dining room, which had been extended into the street for the occasion with tables borrowed from half the households in town. Ramon from the ranch kitchen had been prevailed upon to oversee the cooking, and the result was extraordinary. The children ate with the adults, which some of the more conservative attendees found irregular, and Louis Hayes thanked each of the ranch hands who attended by name, which several of them found touching enough to remember for the rest of their lives. Lucy danced with Louis to music provided by 3 men from the ranch with fiddles, and when the crowd called for another round and he pulled her closer, she put her face near his ear and said, "I have been thinking about you since that morning in April, and I intend to keep thinking about you for a very long time. The feeling," he said, "is mutual and will not diminish." They rode out to the ranch that night, under the November stars, and it was the kind of night that the desert offers a few times a year, cold and clear and enormous, with a sky so full of stars it looked like something painted by someone who was unwilling to be restrained. The first winter of their marriage was a revelation in logistics and love, which are more intertwined than most people acknowledge. Lucy continued to teach, because this was never a question that required discussion. She was a teacher. She would always be a teacher, and Louis had known this from the dirt floor and would have been concerned if she had offered otherwise. She rode to town each morning on the ranch's gentle mare and returned each afternoon, and the 12 miles each day gave her a thinking space she found valuable. Louis renovated a room in the ranch house into a proper study for her, with a writing table and shelves and good light from the south. She moved her books there from the boxes they had been stored in since Ohio, arranging them with the pleasure of someone reuniting with old friends, and when they were on the shelves alongside Alina's books, the mix of the two collections felt right in a way that was difficult to articulate but that both of them understood. In the schoolroom, things had evolved. Enrollment had grown through the fall, and by winter she had 22 students. She had also begun to develop something more systematic than her initial improvised curriculum, a proper progression of lessons, organized by ability rather than age, with the older students helping the younger ones in a structured way that Miguel had essentially invented himself by beginning to do it unofficially, and being so good at it that Lucy formalized it. Miguel, it had become clear, was unusually gifted. He read everything she gave him and returned asking for more. He had a mathematical mind that processed things faster than any student she had taught in 10 years. In January, she sat Louis down after supper and said, "I need to talk to you about Miguel." Louis had been waiting for this conversation for some time, she suspected. He sat down with the attentiveness of a man who had been thinking along similar lines. "He needs more than Cactus Bend can give him," she said. "There's a school in Tucson, Territorial Academy. They take scholarship students." "I know the school," Louis said. "His mother can't afford. I'll fund it," Louis said. "Louis, his father worked my herd for 6 years," Louis said. "This is not charity. This is what I owe." Lucy looked at him for a moment. "You're going to have to let me be the one to talk to his mother," she said. "It has to come from me, not from you, or she won't accept it." "You're right," he said immediately. She talked to Senora Ruiz the following week, carefully and honestly, and Senora Ruiz wept and then composed herself and asked 3 direct questions about the school's character and safety record. And when she was satisfied with the answers, she agreed. The scholarship was arranged through the ranch accounts, structured as a trust that required no public knowledge of its source, and Miguel received his acceptance letter in March with an expression that Lucy memorized carefully, because it was the expression of a young person understanding for the first time the actual dimensions of their own possibility. The morning Miguel packed his trunk for Tucson, he came to the schoolhouse first. Lucy was there early. He stood in the doorway with the same watchful intelligence she had known since the beginning, and she could see under the composure that he was more frightened than he was letting on. "You're ready," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm still scared." "Those aren't contradictory," she said. "Being ready and being scared very often go together. The people who aren't scared usually aren't paying attention." He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "For everything, the scholarship too. I know it's Mr. Hayes." "Then you know you have people who believe in what you're capable of," she said. "That's the part that's scariest," he said. "I know," she said. "Do it anyway." He did. He was gone by mid-March, and the classroom was different without him, not lesser, but changed, the way a room is different after a particular piece of furniture has been moved, not better or worse but rearranged. Spring brought a new enrollment of children, 4 more, including the youngest daughter of Alderman Pierce, who had apparently decided that his objections to the classroom's composition were outweighed by his desire for his daughter to learn to read, a calculation Lucy considered progress even if its motivation was primarily practical. Spring also brought something else. In April, exactly 1 year, almost to the day, since Louis Hayes had ridden down from the ridge and sat in the dirt, Lucy discovered she was pregnant. She told him on the porch in the evening, the same porch where he had put his hand over hers the first time, and his face did the thing she most loved, the unguarded arrival of something he had not known until that moment how much he wanted. He did not say anything immediately. He pulled her to him with a gentleness that was more eloquent than most speeches, and she put her arms around him, and they stood in the April evening with the desert all around them and the mockingbird, which had apparently taken up year-round residence in the mesquite near the schoolhouse, was audible faintly in the distance, even from the ranch. "Is this all right?" he said finally into her hair. "This is extraordinary," she said. "Are you all right?" "I am," he said. "I am very, very much all right." She continued teaching through the spring and most of the summer until late July, when the ride to town and back became impractical on physical grounds alone. She arranged for a young woman named Clara, the daughter of the Methodist minister who had shown some aptitude for instruction, to take over the morning sessions. Clara was 20 and earnest and only slightly terrified, and Lucy spent 2 weeks sitting in the back of the schoolroom going over the lesson plans with her until she was satisfied. The children, being children, tested Clara in the ways children test new teachers. The testing lasted about a week before Clara's fundamental goodness of character won them over, and by the time Lucy stepped back from the classroom, she left it in good order. She was at the ranch house when their son was born in early September of 1879, attended by the town's doctor, who rode out from Cactus Bend and earned every cent of his fee with competence and calm. Lewis was there for all of it, in the way that not all men of his station considered necessary, and he was useful rather than merely present, and Lucy afterward told him that his capacity to be actually useful in difficult circumstances, rather than merely decorative, was among his finest qualities. The boy was healthy and loud, and had, unmistakably, his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, which Lewis found both remarkable and exactly right. They named him James Elliot Hayes James for Lucy's father, Elliot for a leaner Hayes, abbreviated. James was a vigorous and communicative infant who had strong opinions about his schedule from the first week, which his mother found personally satisfying, because she had always believed that people who know their own minds are considerably less trouble in the long run than those who do not. Lucy returned to the classroom in January of 1880, which was earlier than most people thought was advisable, and exactly when she thought it was right. James came with her, tucked in the blanket-lined crate that Lewis had built, a proper carry crate with handles, which was the most practical object she had ever been given, and sat in the back of the room being passed from lap to lap during the lesson while his mother taught mathematics. The children were delighted by James in the way that children are delighted by babies, with a mixture of fascination and proprietary affection that manifested as everyone wanting to hold him simultaneously. Rosie Caldwell, who was now 7, and had developed a personality of such decisive clarity that Lucy often thought she would either run a territory or be a great teacher, held James every single morning with the seriousness of someone carrying out an important function. That spring, Chester Holt came through Cactus Bend again, on his twice-yearly buying circuit. He stopped at the school. Lucy thought with some interest that he had made a point of stopping, rather than passing, and stood in the doorway of the real schoolhouse and looked at 23 children doing their morning work, including Tomás and Paloma, and the children of 3 Mexican families and Alderman Pierce's daughter sitting next to them. And he looked at Lucy Wainwright Hayes at the front of the room with her son in the carry crate beside her chair and her green eyes steady on him. He said, "It seems you've made something of it." "We have," she said. He nodded once with the slight stiffness of a man conceding a point he had argued against, and walked away. It was not a large moment, and she did not make it one. She told Lewis that evening, and he listened and said, "Good. I thought you'd say that," she said. "I'm predictable," he said. "You are not remotely predictable," she said, "except in the best ways." He looked at her across the supper table with James in the high chair between them, industriously investigating the properties of a biscuit with the single-mindedness of a natural scientist. "I would like to tell you something," Lewis said. "Tell me." "The morning I rode down from the ridge," he said. "I had been up there for 3 weeks, and I kept telling myself I was going to ride past and not stop, every morning. And then that morning I watched you with the children, and you were explaining something. I couldn't hear the words from the ridge, I could only see you, and I thought, if you ride past this morning you will regret it for the rest of your life." He paused. "So I rode down." She looked at him for a long moment. James had transferred his attention from the biscuit to his own left foot, which he appeared to find equally fascinating. "I'm glad you did," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." The schoolhouse was expanded that summer. Lewis funded it without ceremony, 2 new rooms, which allowed for a proper division of the younger students from the older ones, and a small attached room that served as a library, which Lucy stocked by writing letters to every educational society and bookseller she had ever dealt with and requesting donations. The response was better than she had expected, because her letters were persuasive, and by autumn the library had 43 books, which she considered a remarkable beginning. She and Lewis established a formal scholarship fund, the Hayes Territorial Education Fund, named without his objection because she insisted the name should acknowledge him openly, which was structured to provide annual support for promising students who could not afford the schools in Tucson and Prescott. It was not a large fund by the standards of Eastern philanthropy, but it was consistent and seriously managed, and over the years it would send 7 children from Cactus Bend on to greater education, including Tomás Ruiz, who followed his brother Miguel 3 years later. Lewis, for his part, had done something that autumn that Lucy did not know about until it was nearly complete. He had been corresponding with a teacher training organization based in Phoenix about the possibility of establishing a regular teacher development program for the Cactus Bend area, a way of supporting rural teachers who had the will and the fundamental skill, but lacked the systematic training that formal education provided. He showed her the correspondence one evening in November, and she sat at the kitchen table reading it while he waited with the careful patience of a man who had done something he hoped was right and was not entirely certain. She read it 3 times. Then she looked up. "This is for other Lucys," she said. "Yes," he said. "Women like me who ended up in silver mining camps making do with what they had because no one had thought to give them what they needed." "Yes," he said. She set the letters down. "You've been doing this for months." "Since the summer," he said. "I wanted to make sure it was viable before I said anything." She looked at him steadily. "Lewis Hayes," she said, "you are the best man I know." He looked slightly uncomfortable with this in the way of people who are genuinely modest. "I have the resources," he said. "It would be wasteful not to use them well." "That is not the totality of what you are," she said. "You are allowed to simply be good." He held her gaze for a moment. "You help," he said simply. They sat in their kitchen, Eleanor Hayes's kitchen, now also Lucy Wainwright's kitchen, and entirely their kitchen together, while James slept in his room, and the ranch was quiet outside, and the November wind moved across the desert in long sweeps that sounded like the desert breathing. And Lewis put his hand over hers on the table, and she turned her hand over under his, the same as the first time, and everything in the world was exactly where it ought to be. 3 years into their marriage, in the spring of 1882, Lucy learned she was pregnant again. She was 30 and Lewis was 35, and James was 2.5, and had recently discovered that he could climb most of the furniture in the ranch house, a discovery that was keeping everyone occupied. This pregnancy was easier than the first in some ways and harder in others, because pregnancy is like that. And by now Lucy had no patience for pretending that hard things were fine when they were not. She taught until June, and then conceded the heat, and the heaviness and the practical impossibility of managing 24 children and a 2-year-old, and the 3rd trimester simultaneously. Clara Minister Foster's daughter Clara, who had grown into a confident and genuinely skilled teacher over the past 2 years, ran the school with full competence, and Lucy visited 3 times a week to consult on curriculum, which was enough to feel connected and not enough to be exhausting. Their daughter was born in August of 1882, during a monsoon thunderstorm that arrived at the precise moment of transition between one phase of the labor and the next, which Lucy later said was either significant or coincidental, and she could not decide which. The doctor barely made it through the rain in time. Lewis was there again, steady and useful again, which she expected and relied on entirely. The girl arrived in the middle of the thunder and was immediately, absolutely, entirely herself. She was smaller than James had been and louder and more deliberate in her demands, and Lewis picked her up with the careful reverence of a man who had been moved by this before but was no less moved for the repetition. They named her Eleanor Lucy Hayes, which was both names and entirely intentional, and when Lucy said she wanted Eleanor first, Lewis said nothing except that it was right, and it was. Ellie, as she quickly became, had her grandmother's books to grow up with and her mother's determination, and her father's patience, and the ranch and the desert, and the schoolhouse and 20-some children who rotated around her, and James with the ease of an extended family. She grew up understanding that learning was what one did, and that sitting in the dirt to learn something was not beneath anyone, and that the most important thing about a room was who was allowed in it. James, by the time Ellie was old enough to come to school, was himself a student of Lucy's, a peculiar thing, teaching one's own child, though Lucy managed it with the same fair, unsentimental competence she brought to everything. And James proved to be a good student primarily because he was constitutionally unable to be in a room where something was being explained and not want to understand it, which was not his mother's trait alone. Miguel wrote from Tucson twice a year. He had excelled at the Territorial Academy and had received a place at a university in California, which was a thing that Lucy held in her mind on difficult days as evidence that the work mattered. His letters were formal and warm, written in English and then Spanish in alternate paragraphs, because he had told her once that thinking in both felt more complete than thinking in one. Louis read the letters too, everyone, and always said the same thing when he finished. "Good. You always say good," Lucy told him the fourth time. "It's always good," he said. In the fall of 1884, the railroad came through Cactus Bend, as the men in expensive suits had been promising for years. The town changed in the way that frontier towns change when the railroad arrives quickly, and not entirely in ways that were comfortable, though the overall trajectory was toward stability and growth. New people arrived. New businesses opened. The schoolhouse was too small again within a year, and Lucy led the fundraising for a proper two-room expansion with windows on all four sides and a covered porch for the days when the heat made outdoor learning more reasonable than indoor. Louis donated the first funds and organized the building committee with the same practical efficiency he brought to anything structural. The expansion was done in 6 weeks and opened on a Monday in October to a classroom of 31 students, and Lucy stood at the door of the new building and thought about the first morning, the muslin canopy, the pointed stick, the red dirt. The globe passed from hand to hand like something holy. She thought about the sound of hooves on the ridge road. Louis appeared beside her in the doorway. He had a habit of appearing when she was thinking about him, which she had mentioned, and he had said it was a statistical likelihood given how often she apparently thought about him, which was the most satisfying thing he had ever said to her. 31, he said, looking at the full room. 31, she agreed. And the library has how many books now? 247 as of last week, she said. 2 more packages arrived from St. Louis on Friday, he smiled. The full smile which she never tired of and which he distributed with sufficient restraint that it always felt like receiving something. My mother used to order books from St. Louis, he said. I know, she said. You told me. She would be unbearably pleased, he said. She would, Lucy agreed. So am I. He put his arm around her shoulders, briefly, in the doorway of the school he had made possible and she had made real, and they stood looking at 31 children beginning another morning, and the light was coming in through the east-facing windows exactly as she had specified, and somewhere in the mesquite that had grown considerably in 6 years, a mockingbird was performing with a complexity and enthusiasm that suggested it was conducting something important. James was at his bench near the window, already working ahead of the lesson, his dark head bent over a book with the concentrated absorption of someone who has found the place he fits. Rosie Caldwell, who was now 12 and had taken it upon herself to be the unofficial ambassador of the school to any new student who arrived looking frightened, was at the back bench with a new girl who had arrived with the railroad workers' families and did not yet speak much English, showing her the alphabet from the primer in a way that was so patient and kind that Lucy made a note to herself to encourage it formally. And in the front of the room, at the teacher's table, was Clara Foster, 26 now and fully grown into her confidence, leading the morning's first lesson with a warmth and precision that made Lucy both proud and relieved. She was not needed in the room. She was needed everywhere else. That understanding arrived with a completeness that felt like peace, She turned from the doorway and looked at Louis, who was watching her with the steady dark attention that had never dimmed in 6 years and showed no sign of dimming. "Come with me," she said. "Where are we going?" he said. "I want to see the ridge," she said. "From the top." They rode up together on 2 horses from the ranch stable. The gentle mare was Lucy's now, entirely up the ridge road that Louis had ridden alone every morning for the years before he sat down in the dirt. It was a clear October morning, the desert in the particular quiet of the fall, and from the top of the ridge the town of Cactus Bend was spread below them, small and real and full of the ordinary life of 400 people going about their days. The schoolhouse was visible, its new eastern windows catching the morning sun, a thin column of smoke from the hotel chimney. The general store with its porch, where Mrs. Pepper was sweeping with her usual thoroughness. The church, the livery, the railroad depot that was new and still smelled of fresh timber when you walked past it. The streets between, where people and horses moved about in the unhurried morning rhythm of a town that had a future. "There," Louis said and pointed. From the ridge at this distance, the schoolhouse was a clear square shape with the porch addition visible on one side and the yard where the children played at noon. "That's where I was," Lucy said. "That's where you were," he agreed. She looked at it for a long moment. From up here, she could see the patch of ground where the first makeshift classroom had been, the abandoned foundation, now integrated into the town's texture, a part of the past that had been overtaken by the present in the way that real progress works. "You sat in the dirt," she said. "Best decision I ever made," he said. "What were you thinking?" she asked. "When you rode down that morning, what were you actually thinking?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the town below. "I was thinking that you were teaching those children like every child in that dirt was worth the whole of your attention," he said. "I was thinking that I had not seen anyone do anything with that quality of intention in a very long time." He paused. "I was thinking that I wanted to understand what that felt like, to be in it." "And did you," she said, "understand it?" "I understood something better than I expected," he said. "I understood that you were the most alive person I had ever been in the same room with, and that the room was a piece of dirt, and that it didn't matter." Lucy looked at him. The morning light on the ridge was clear and without shadow, and he looked exactly like himself, the man who had ridden down from this ridge one April morning and sat down and changed both their lives with the simple, radical act of being willing to learn. She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. He held it without speaking, because the speaking had been done and the holding was the right language now. Below them, the town of Cactus Bend moved through its Tuesday morning. The schoolhouse windows shone. The mockingbird, wherever it had gone, was probably singing. 31 children were learning things they would carry for the rest of their lives. 2 horses stood on the ridge road, side by side, and their riders looked down at what they had made together, and the desert was all around them in every direction, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and inside the warmth of their particular, deliberate, stubbornly sustained love, none of the indifference touched them at all. Lucy squeezed his hand. He squeezed back, and the morning went on, as mornings do, ordinary and extraordinary and entirely sufficient.